They thought he was just another customer, a man too ordinary to matter, too simple to take seriously. But what they didn't know was that he had come prepared, watching every move, waiting for the moment when their secrets would unravel. And when a body is found in the kitchen, everyone's true colors are exposed. Because in this restaurant, appearances aren't just deceiving, they're deadly. The restaurant bustled with its usual midweek lunchtime crowd. Waiters darted between tables, balancing trays loaded with steaming dishes, while a faint hum of conversation filled the air. It was a place that prided itself on its reputation, a high-end establishment where elegance met exclusivity. The clientele often reflected that image: sharply dressed professionals, socialites in tailored attire, and the occasional business tycoon in town for meetings. Amid the flurry of activity, a man walked in. His entrance wasn't grand or attention-seeking. He wore a simple navy jacket and jeans, his sneakers showing signs of wear. The hostess, standing by the podium near the entrance, glanced up and hesitated. Her polite smile faltered for a moment, betraying her first impression. He didn't look like the type to frequent a place like this. She masked her initial reaction with a trained professional demeanor and greeted him warmly. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice neutral. The man nodded. "Yes, please," he replied, his tone calm and unhurried. Her hand hovered over the reservation list, though she knew he wouldn't be on it. After a brief pause, she picked up a menu and led him to a table near the back, far from the large windows that overlooked the bustling street. It was the kind of table usually reserved for walk-ins who didn't quite fit the profile of the regular clientele. As he settled into his seat, the man observed the room with a quiet attentiveness. His gaze wasn't intrusive or judgmental. It was almost as if he were studying the space, taking in the details. The polished floors, the gleaming glassware, the faint scent of fresh flowers mixed with the aroma of grilled meats. It all seemed to interest him in a way that felt out of place for a mere diner. Soon, a waitress approached his table. Her name tag read Chloe, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had worked in the industry for years. Chloe wasn't just a server. She was a self-proclaimed expert at reading people. One glance at a customer, and she'd decide how much effort they were worth. This man, with his worn sneakers and simple clothes, didn't seem like he was worth much. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice laced with a hint of mock cheerfulness. "Can I start you off with some water, or would you like to see our wine list?" The man smiled faintly. "Just water, thank you," he replied. "And the menu, please." Chloe handed him the menu, but as she did, her eyes flicked to his hands. No expensive watch, no gold rings. Her lips curled into a subtle smirk. She'd seen his type before. Walk-ins who would order the cheapest dish on the menu, linger too long, and leave a minimal tip. She'd play along for now, but her mind was already elsewhere. As the man opened the menu, Chloe leaned in slightly. "Just to let you know, our specials today are the filet mignon and the seafood risotto. Both are very popular," she said, her tone almost patronizing. The man glanced up, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "I'll decide soon," he said simply, then returned his attention to the menu. Chloe straightened, a hint of irritation flickering across her face. She had expected a quick, awkward response, something that confirmed her assumptions. But there was something about his calmness, his lack of fluster, that unsettled her slightly. She brushed it off and turned to attend to another table, leaving him alone. As the man browsed the menu, a faint smile played on his lips. His fingers lightly tapped the edge of the table, as if in thought. To anyone watching, he appeared perfectly ordinary, just another diner in a busy restaurant. But if they had looked closer, they might have noticed the way his eyes lingered on certain details, the way he seemed to know the place better than a first-time guest should. In the distance, Chloe chatted with the restaurant manager, laughing as she recounted a story about difficult customers. The man, still seated quietly, took a sip of the water the hostess had placed earlier. His gaze shifted to the staff as they moved around, and though his face remained calm, there was something deliberate about his demeanor. He wasn't just a customer. He was here for a reason. And Chloe, oblivious to the truth, had no idea how close she was to the storm that was about to unravel. Chloe returned to his table after what felt like an intentional delay. She had spent the past few minutes serving other customers, ones she deemed more deserving of her time. When she finally approached, her notepad was ready, and her tone carried an edge of impatience masked by a forced politeness. "Have you decided yet?" she asked, not even trying to meet his eyes. The man set the menu down gently. "I'll have the herb-crusted salmon," he said, his voice steady and unbothered. "And could you tell me, how fresh is the salmon here?" Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't the kind of thing her usual customers asked, especially not someone she had mentally categorized as a basic diner. She hesitated for a moment before responding, her tone slightly defensive. "It's flown in daily. Only the best quality here." The man nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Good. Then I'll trust it's as fresh as it should be." There was something unsettling about the way he said it. Calm, measured, almost as though he knew more than he let on. Chloe didn't like the way it made her feel. She quickly jotted down the order and moved away, muttering under her breath about picky customers. As she walked toward the kitchen, she passed Sophia, who was balancing a tray full of desserts. "What's wrong?" Sophia asked, noticing Chloe's sour expression. "Nothing," Chloe replied sharply, but then rolled her eyes. "Just dealing with one of those asterisk customers. You know the type. Comes in looking like they can barely afford the tip, then acts like they're some kind of food critic." Sophia frowned but didn't respond immediately. She glanced over her shoulder at the man in question, who was calmly sipping his water and occasionally glancing around the room. "He doesn't look like he's giving you a hard time," she said softly. "Exactly," Chloe snapped, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's the way they pretend to be calm that gets me. Like they're too good for this place but can't even afford the wine list." Sophia's frown deepened. "Chloe, you shouldn't be so quick to judge people. You never know their story." Chloe scoffed and waved her off. "Trust me, I know his story. I've seen it 100 times before." But as Chloe disappeared into the kitchen, Sophia lingered for a moment, her gaze drifting back to the man. There was something about him, something quiet yet commanding, that didn't quite fit Chloe's assumptions. Sophia shook off the thought and returned to her own work, but a seed of curiosity had been planted. Back at the table, the man continued observing the restaurant with a calm intensity. His gaze lingered on the interactions between the staff, the flow of orders, and the efficiency, or lack thereof, in how things were run. Every now and then, his eyes narrowed slightly, as though he were mentally noting details. Chloe returned with his order after what felt like an unnecessarily long wait. She set the plate down with a perfunctory smile, barely making eye contact. "Enjoy," she said curtly before walking away without another word. The man glanced at the dish, inspecting it for a moment. He took a bite and nodded slightly, a faint smile returning to his face. The food was as good as he'd expected it to be, but it wasn't the food that interested him. His attention shifted again, this time to the kitchen doors that swung open every few seconds as staff moved in and out. He seemed to be counting something, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. Meanwhile, Chloe hovered at another table, chatting animatedly with a group of well-dressed patrons. She laughed loudly at their jokes, her demeanor completely different from how she had treated the quiet man earlier. But even as she smiled and charmed, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, that unsettled her. Across the room, the restaurant manager emerged, greeting customers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He stopped by Chloe's side and whispered something to her, making her nod eagerly. It was a reminder about the new owner's upcoming visit, a visit she was determined to use to her advantage. The black customer, sitting quietly at his table, observed the exchange. His faint smile deepened, but his expression remained unreadable. He took another bite of his salmon, savoring it as though he had all the time in the world. Unbeknownst to Chloe, the clock was ticking, and the balance of power in her carefully controlled world was about to shift in ways she could never have imagined. The restaurant buzzed with its usual rhythm, but for Chloe, the shift began to feel strangely off. She couldn't explain it, but something about the man's presence gnawed at her. He wasn't doing anything disruptive. If anything, he was one of the quietest customers she had ever served. Yet his calm, deliberate demeanor unsettled her. Chloe brushed off the thought, reminding herself that she had more important matters to focus on. The manager had just announced that the new owner's visit was imminent. This was her moment to shine, to impress someone who might open doors to promotions, better tips, or even a transfer to a higher profile location. The idea sent a jolt of excitement through her. She quickly returned to her polished, professional self, choosing to ignore the irritation bubbling under the surface. The black customer, meanwhile, continued his quiet observation. His food was nearly finished, but he lingered at the table, his eyes darting between the staff and the restaurant layout. He seemed to pay particular attention to the manager, whose brisk, authoritative movements revealed a man accustomed to control. The manager, though charming on the surface, occasionally barked sharp orders at staff when he thought no one was watching. Chloe approached the customer's table again, her smile forced but wide. "How's everything?" she asked, her voice overly sweet. "Delicious," he replied, setting his fork down. "Your salmon is as good as I hoped it would be." Her smile tightened. His tone, though polite, carried an undertone she couldn't place, something that made her feel as though she were missing part of a larger conversation. "Glad to hear it," she said briskly. "Anything else I can get for you?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking with hers for a moment too long. "Not right now," he said, his voice calm as ever. "Though I might have a few questions about the restaurant later. It's fascinating." Chloe blinked, confused by the comment. She forced another smile and stepped away, muttering under her breath about odd customers. From the corner of the room, Sophia watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. She had been observing the man, too, though with far less judgment than Chloe. There was something about him, something composed yet deliberate, that piqued her interest. When she wasn't attending to her table, she found herself stealing glances in his direction. The man, seemingly oblivious to the attention, continued his slow inspection of the room. His gaze settled on a painting hanging above the fireplace, a large, abstract piece that added a modern touch to the otherwise classic decor. He studied it intently, his expression momentarily unreadable, before his eyes shifted back to the kitchen doors. Behind those doors, the staff bustled around, preparing for the private meeting with the new owner. Tension was thick in the air as the kitchen staff murmured about the potential changes that might come. Some were worried about layoffs. Others speculated about stricter management. No one, however, had any idea who the new owner was, or that he was sitting just beyond those swinging doors. The manager strode into the kitchen, his presence commanding immediate attention. "We've got to be perfect today," he said, his voice firm. "No mistakes, no excuses. If the new owner isn't impressed, we're all at risk." "Understood." The staff nodded, murmuring their agreement, though their nervous glances spoke volumes. One of the line cooks whispered to another, "Whoever this guy is, I hope he's not as cutthroat as the last one." Back in the dining area, Chloe found herself distracted as she worked. She fumbled an order at another table, spilling a glass of water and earning a sharp look from a wealthy couple. The man at the table smirked slightly, but said nothing, his composure unshaken. "Get it together, Chloe," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. She couldn't afford to lose focus now, not with the owner on his way. But even as she tried to regain control, her eyes kept drifting back to the man. There was something about him that didn't add up, something that refused to fit into the neat little box where she had placed him. And he wasn't leaving. Instead, he sat there, perfectly calm, as though he had all the time in the world. Time that, unbeknownst to Chloe, was steadily running out for her, and for everyone else in the room. The kitchen grew hotter as the pressure mounted. The staff scrambled to meet the expectations set by the manager, whose stern orders cut through the air like a knife. He paced back and forth, checking the plating of dishes and barking corrections with an intensity that bordered on manic. Everyone knew the stakes. This wasn't just about impressing some random owner. It was about securing their futures in a business that could easily replace them. The manager, Greg, was known for his charm in public and his volatility behind closed doors. Out in the dining room, he was all smiles, shaking hands with regulars and ensuring they felt like royalty. But in the back, he ruled with an iron fist, expecting perfection and tolerating no dissent. Today, however, there was an edge to his behavior that even the staff found unsettling. Greg's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he stepped into a small storage room to take the call. The space was cramped and dimly lit, the faint smell of cleaning chemicals lingering in the air. "What is it?" he snapped, his voice low but urgent. The person on the other end spoke quickly, their words muffled but panicked. Greg's face tightened, a flicker of worry flashing across his features. "Don't call me again," he hissed before ending the call abruptly. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain composure. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie and smoothed down his shirt. When Greg returned to the kitchen, his demeanor was colder than before. The staff avoided his gaze, sensing that something was wrong, but not daring to ask. He clapped his hands sharply. "Focus, people. We don't have time for mistakes today." Out in the dining room, the black customer finished his meal, wiping his mouth with a napkin and setting it neatly on the table. Chloe approached again, her nerves slightly frayed from the tension building in the restaurant. She forced a smile, though it barely reached her eyes. "Was everything to your satisfaction?" she asked, her voice tight. The man nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "It was excellent. You have a talented chef back there." Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. For a moment, she almost felt guilty about the way she had treated him earlier. But then she reminded herself of her original assumptions. People like him didn't come here for the food. They came for the experience of being somewhere they couldn't really afford. "Great to hear," she said quickly, eager to move on. "Would you like the check?" The man smiled faintly. "Not just yet. I think I'll stay a little longer. It's an interesting place." Chloe hesitated, but she nodded and left him alone, muttering under her breath as she walked away. The man's attention shifted to Greg, who had emerged from the kitchen and was now making his rounds among the tables. Greg's charm was back on full display as he greeted customers with practiced enthusiasm. When he noticed Chloe lingering nearby, he motioned her over. "Chloe, how's everything going?" he asked, his tone a mix of professional concern and subtle judgment. "Good," Chloe replied quickly, eager to prove herself. "I've been keeping up with my tables, and I'm ready for the owner's visit." Greg gave her a tight smile. "Good, but remember, first impressions are everything. Don't let your guard down, especially today." Chloe nodded, her stomach twisting slightly. The weight of Greg's expectations bore down on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that one misstep could ruin everything. As Greg turned to leave, the black customer's gaze followed him. There was something almost predatory in the way the man watched Greg. Calm, calculating, as though he were dissecting every move the manager made. For the first time, Greg seemed to sense the weight of someone's attention on him. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting the man's. For a split second, his charming mask slipped, and a flicker of unease crossed his face. The man smiled, a faint, knowing smile that only deepened Greg's discomfort. Greg quickly turned away, his steps faltering slightly as he disappeared into the kitchen once more. Back at his table, the man leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He tapped his fingers lightly against the edge of the table, his rhythm steady and deliberate. The game was unfolding, and he was in no rush to reveal his next move. The restaurant's energy shifted as the afternoon progressed. There was an unspoken tension rippling through the staff, a feeling that something was brewing just beneath the surface. The sound of plates clinking and soft chatter from customers couldn't quite mask the growing unease. Greg had retreated into the kitchen, barking orders with renewed fervor. His earlier phone call seemed to have rattled him more than he let on. His sharp tone cut through the air, leaving the staff on edge as they scrambled to meet his increasingly unreasonable demands. At the same time, Chloe found herself drawn back to the black customer's table, though she couldn't explain why. He hadn't asked for anything else, but his quiet presence unnerved her. She decided to check on him again, partly to dispel her own discomfort and partly out of curiosity. "Still enjoying your time here?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The man glanced up at her, his calm expression unchanging. "I am," he said simply. "It's a fascinating place. The staff, the design, even the history, it's all very intricate." Chloe furrowed her brow. "You seem to know a lot about this place," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. The man smiled faintly, but he didn't respond directly. Instead, he gestured toward the large painting above the fireplace. "That's new, isn't it?" he asked. Chloe blinked, thrown off by the question. Yeah," she replied after a pause. "The manager had it put up a few months ago. Why?" The man's gaze lingered on the painting for a moment before he turned back to her. "No reason," he said, his tone neutral. "Just curious." Chloe opened her mouth to ask another question, but she stopped herself. Something about him made her reluctant to press further. Instead, she muttered a quick, "Let me know if you need anything," before walking away. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Greg was losing his composure. He slammed a tray down onto the counter, startling the line cooks. "I need those entrees out now," he barked, his voice echoing through the room. Sophia, standing near the back of the kitchen, exchanged a nervous glance with one of the cooks. She had worked under Greg long enough to know when something was seriously wrong. His usual temper was bad, but this was different. There was an edge to him today that she couldn't ignore. She approached cautiously, her voice low. "Greg, is everything okay? You seem tense." Greg shot her a sharp look. "Just do your job, Sophia," he snapped. Sophia flinched but didn't back down. "I am doing my job," she said quietly, "but something's obviously bothering you. Maybe you should step outside for a minute, take a breath." Greg's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But then he turned away, muttering something under his breath. He grabbed a dish towel and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving the staff in stunned silence. Back in the dining room, Chloe watched as Greg strode past her, his expression dark. She frowned. Her curiosity piqued. It wasn't like Greg to lose his composure in front of customers, no matter how stressful things got. Her attention shifted back to the black customer, who was now leaning slightly forward in his chair, watching Greg's movements with that same unsettling calm. Chloe felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just the man's presence that unnerved her anymore. It was the way he seemed to be waiting for something, as if he already knew what was about to happen. And for the first time, Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't end well. Greg pushed open the back door of the restaurant, stepping into the alleyway behind the building. The air was cold and biting, but it did little to calm his nerves. He paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair as he muttered to himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, and he pulled it out, staring at the screen. The same number as before. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "I told you not to call again," he said, his voice low and angry. The voice on the other end was sharp and insistent, though the words were inaudible. Greg's expression darkened as he listened, his free hand balling into a fist. "I said I'd handle it," he hissed. "Just keep your mouth shut. Do you understand me?" The voice replied, and Greg's jaw tightened. He ended the call abruptly, stuffing the phone back into his pocket. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the ground, his breathing heavy. Then, with a sharp exhale, he straightened his tie and forced himself to re-enter the restaurant. Inside, the atmosphere had grown quieter, but the tension was palpable. Chloe was bustling between tables, her movements quick and purposeful as she tried to keep up with her tasks. Yet her mind kept drifting back to the black customer. He still sat at his table, his posture relaxed but his eyes keenly focused on everything around him. It was almost as though he were waiting for a show to begin. Chloe's curiosity got the better of her. She approached Sophia, who was setting down drinks at another table. "Hey," Chloe said in a low voice, glancing toward the black customer. "That guy, something's weird about him, right?" Sophia followed her gaze, her brow furrowing slightly. "Weird how?" she asked. "I don't know," Chloe admitted. "He's just too calm, like he's watching us for something." Sophia shrugged. "Maybe he's just observant. Not everyone has to act like they own the place to be confident, you know." Chloe frowned, her irritation rising. "I'm telling you, something's off about him. He keeps making these comments like he knows more than he should." Sophia sighed. "Chloe, maybe he's just a quiet guy who likes good food. Not everyone's out to get you." Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the kitchen doors swung open and Greg emerged. His face was pale, and his movements were stiff, as though he were holding himself together by sheer willpower. He scanned the dining room, his gaze briefly landing on the black customer before flicking away. The man noticed Greg's glance and smiled faintly. He folded his napkin neatly and set it aside, leaning back in his chair. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Chloe, watching from across the room, felt her stomach twist. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was about to happen. Greg made his way to the front of the restaurant, where he began speaking with the hostess in hushed tones. Whatever he was saying, it clearly wasn't pleasant. His gestures were sharp, his tone clipped. The hostess nodded nervously, avoiding his gaze. The black customer stood up, drawing Chloe's attention. He didn't leave his table, though. Instead, he began walking slowly through the restaurant, his movements deliberate. His eyes scanned the room as though he were taking it all in for the first time. Greg noticed him and froze for a moment. Their eyes met across the dining room, and something unspoken passed between them. Greg's expression tightened, and he quickly turned away, disappearing back into the kitchen. The man stopped near the large painting above the fireplace, studying it again. Chloe found herself rooted in place, watching him. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" she asked, her voice shakier than she intended. He turned to her, his smile faint but polite. "No, thank you," he said. "I'm just appreciating the details." His words sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know what he meant, but deep down, she felt it wasn't just about the painting. The restaurant's hum grew quieter as the lunch crowd began to thin. Tables were cleared, and the remaining patrons were served with less urgency. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension was only intensifying. The staff moved around the dining area with practiced efficiency, but there was a noticeable edge to their movements, as if everyone were bracing for something they couldn't quite name. The black customer had returned to his seat, calm as ever. He sipped his water slowly, his eyes occasionally drifting to the kitchen doors. Chloe found herself watching him again, unable to shake the feeling that he was more than he appeared to be. It frustrated her how unbothered he seemed, like he belonged here more than she ever would. From the back of the restaurant, Greg emerged again, his face a shade paler than before. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a stiffness that made his movements look almost robotic. He scanned the dining room quickly, his gaze briefly landing on the black customer before darting away. Greg made his way toward Chloe, who immediately straightened her posture, hoping for a chance to redeem herself. He stopped beside her, his voice low but firm. "Chloe, I need you to focus," he said. "The new owner could be here any moment, and I can't have anyone messing this up." Chloe nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. Everything's under control." Greg's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he didn't quite believe her. "Good. Just make sure you're on your best behavior. No slip-ups." With that, he moved on, leaving Chloe feeling both annoyed and uneasy. She glanced back at the black customer, who seemed to be watching her with quiet amusement. Sophia, standing near the bar, caught Chloe's eye and gestured her over. "What was that about?" she asked in a hushed tone. Chloe rolled her eyes. "Greg's just being Greg, freaking out over nothing and taking it out on us." Sophia frowned. "He's been acting really strange today. Did you see how pale he looked? I think something's going on." Chloe crossed her arms. "Yeah, well, if he'd stop micromanaging everything, maybe he'd have time to deal with whatever his problem is." Sophia hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the kitchen. "I heard him on the phone earlier. He sounded Scared? That's not like him. Chloe raised an eyebrow. Greg? Scared? I'll believe it when I see it. Sophia shrugged. I'm just saying. Something's not right. As the two whispered near the bar, the black customer stood from his table again. This time he walked toward the kitchen doors, pausing just outside them. He glanced around as though making sure no one was watching too closely before stepping back into the dining area. Chloe noticed him and felt a spark of irritation. She approached quickly, her tone sharper than she intended. Sir, is there something you're looking for? The man turned to her, his calm expression unchanged. No, I was just admiring the flow of the place, he said. It's fascinating how everything works together. Chloe frowned. Well, if you need something, please let us know. Otherwise, I'd ask you to remain at your table. The man nodded politely, but there was something in his eyes, something knowing, that made Chloe's stomach twist. As he returned to his seat, the kitchen doors swung open, and Greg stormed out once again. His face was flushed now, his earlier pallor replaced with a redness that hinted at growing anger. He headed straight for the hostess, his voice low but sharp as he gave her new instructions. Chloe couldn't hear what he was saying, but the way the hostess nodded nervously told her it wasn't good. The black customer watched Greg intently, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that Chloe couldn't ignore. For the first time, she felt a flicker of fear. Something was about to break. The restaurant's energy shifted further, teetering between unease and outright tension. The staff's movements grew sharper, their voices quieter, as though afraid to draw attention to themselves. Even the customers who remained seemed to sense the shift, their conversations tapering off into murmurs. Something unseen but palpable hung in the air. Greg, now visibly sweating, paced near the kitchen doors, barking occasional orders to the staff. His usual charm had completely evaporated, replaced by a harsh edge that made everyone avoid eye contact with him. Even Chloe, who had always prided herself on staying composed under pressure, found herself rattled by his erratic behavior. At her own station, Chloe busied herself clearing plates, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts kept circling back to the black customer, who still sat quietly at his table. He had been there far longer than any other diner, yet he showed no signs of leaving. His demeanor, calm yet commanding, gnawed at her nerves. When Chloe caught Greg glancing in the man's direction, his face tight with unease, it only deepened her suspicions. Why was Greg so on edge about him? What was it about this one customer that seemed to disrupt the balance of the entire restaurant? Behind the scenes, the tension boiled over. In the kitchen, the cooks whispered amongst themselves, exchanging worried glances as Greg stormed through the room like a tornado. His earlier phone calls had not gone unnoticed, and the staff speculated wildly about what could be happening. Sophia, meanwhile, worked quietly in the corner, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged desserts on a tray. She had seen Greg unravel before, but today felt different, darker. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of desperation, that unsettled her. When Greg finally left the kitchen, muttering angrily to himself, Sophia turned to one of the cooks. "Do you think he knows the new owner is already here?" she whispered. The cook raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Sophia hesitated, glancing toward the dining room. "I don't know. There's just something about that guy at table 9. The way Greg keeps looking at him, it's like he knows something we don't." The cook snorted. "Greg's always paranoid, probably just stressed about the inspection or whatever." But Sophia wasn't convinced. She had seen the way the black customer moved, how he carried himself with an authority that didn't match his unassuming appearance. And she had seen the way Greg reacted to him, like he was trying to avoid being cornered. In the dining room, the black customer finished his water and set the glass down gently. He folded his hands on the table, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room where Greg was speaking to the hostess. It was as though he were waiting for something, or someone. Chloe couldn't take it anymore. She approached Sophia as she returned from the kitchen, her voice low and urgent. "I think Greg's hiding something," she said. Sophia frowned. "What do you mean?" Chloe gestured subtly toward the black customer. "That guy, he's not just some random diner. I don't know who he is, but I think Greg does. He's been acting weird all day, and it's like every time he looks at him, he's about to snap." Sophia hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "You think he's the new owner?" Chloe blinked, startled by the suggestion. "What? No, that's—" She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. "Could it be?" Sophia continued, her voice a whisper. "Think about it. Greg's been freaking out all day. That guy's been sitting here like he owns the place, and Greg keeps looking at him like he's waiting for the hammer to drop." Chloe shook her head, trying to dismiss the idea, but doubt was already creeping in. The man's quiet confidence, his cryptic remarks, the way he seemed to know the restaurant better than he should, it all pointed to something bigger than she was willing to admit. Greg's voice snapped them out of their hushed conversation. "Chloe! Sophia!" They both turned, startled. Greg's face was red, his expression twisted with barely contained anger. "What are you two standing round for?" he barked. "Get back to work." Chloe nodded quickly, retreating to her section. Sophia, however, lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she watched Greg. There was something off about him today, something more than just stress. And then it happened. The kitchen doors burst open and one of the line cooks ran out, his face pale as a sheet. "Greg," he shouted, his voice shaking, "you need to see this, now!" The room went silent. All eyes turned toward the cook, whose hands were trembling as he gestured toward the kitchen. Greg's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he stormed past the cook and into the kitchen. Chloe and Sophia exchanged a glance, their unease growing. Whatever was happening, it was about to crack the thin veneer of control that Greg had desperately tried to maintain. And the black customer, still seated at his table, watched it all unfold with quiet intensity, his fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the table. The air in the dining room grew thick with unease as Greg disappeared into the kitchen, his steps heavy and purposeful. The line cook who had summoned him lingered near the door, his face pale and his breathing uneven. The staff exchanged nervous glances, whispering amongst themselves. Whatever had been discovered, it wasn't good. In the kitchen, the tension snapped like a taut wire. Greg halted just inside the door, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Sophia, who had trailed closer to the kitchen than she probably should have, caught a glimpse of his reaction through the swinging doors before they closed again. Moments later, a crash echoed from within the kitchen, followed by Greg's raised voice. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his tone sharp and filled with panic. Chloe froze in place, halfway to clearing another table. The sharpness of Greg's voice made her blood run cold. She glanced toward Sophia, who had crept closer to the kitchen doors, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Sophia peeked inside, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open just enough to see. What she saw made her stagger back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Chloe rushed over, grabbing her arm. "What is it? What's going on?" Sophia's wide eyes filled with horror as she shook her head. It's blood," she whispered. "Blood?" Chloe's voice dropped to a whisper, her heart racing. Sophia nodded, her face pale. "On the floor, near the storage room." Chloe's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay composed. "What else? Is someone hurt?" Sophia shook her head again, this time more violently. "I don't know. I didn't see anyone. Just Greg. He looked terrified." In the kitchen, Greg stood frozen, staring at the crimson streaks smeared across the floor. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, turning his stomach. His mind raced as he pieced together the implications of what he was seeing. The storage room door was ajar, revealing a darkened space beyond. Greg's breath hitched as he took a step closer, his shoes sticking slightly to the floor with every step. He stopped just short of the threshold, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the line cook stammered, I don't know how it got there. I swear, it wasn't there earlier." Greg shot him a sharp look. "Shut up," he hissed, his voice trembling. He pushed the door open wider, his breath catching as the dim light revealed more, a trail of blood leading deeper into the room. Greg's pulse roared in his ears as he hesitated, torn between his fear and the need to understand what was happening. "Call the police," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Back in the dining room, the customers began to take notice of the commotion. The sound of Greg's raised voice, followed by the hurried footsteps of the staff, had drawn their attention. Murmurs spread across the room, speculation bubbling just beneath the surface. The black customer, however, remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He watched Chloe and Sophia from a distance, noting their hushed conversation and the fear etched on their faces. His fingers tapped a slow, steady rhythm on the edge of the table, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Chloe, unable to take the suspense any longer, approached the black customer's table. "Sir," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "is there something you know about what's happening?" He looked up at her, his eyes calm but piercing. "What makes you think I know anything?" he asked, his tone even. Chloe hesitated, her mind scrambling for a response. I don't know. It's just, you've been here a long time, and you seem to notice things." The man leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "Noticing things isn't a crime," he said, his voice almost teasing. Chloe swallowed hard, unsure whether to feel relieved or more unnerved. "Right. Well, let me know if you need anything," she muttered before retreating back toward Sophia. The tension in the restaurant was now palpable, and the murmurs from the other patrons grew louder. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, but no one dared to leave their seats. Greg burst through the kitchen doors moments later, his face ashen and his expression tight. He glanced around the dining room, his eyes darting to the hostess. "Shut it down," he ordered. "Now, everyone out." The hostess froze, confused. "But the owner—" "I said asterisk shut it down," Greg roared, slamming his hand against the nearest table. The sound echoed across the room, silencing everyone. Chloe and Sophia exchanged a glance, their unease growing. Whatever Greg had found, it was bad enough to make him lose complete control. And through it all, the black customer remained seated, his calm demeanor in eerie contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. He picked up his glass, taking a slow sip of water, his gaze fixed on Greg with quiet intensity. The storm that had been brewing all day was finally breaking, and Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The restaurant had descended into chaos. Greg's sudden outburst and the order to evacuate left customers and staff alike in a state of confusion and fear. The once harmonious atmosphere was now thick with panic. Patrons hurriedly gathered their belongings, whispering anxiously as they made their way to the exit. The staff attempted to guide them out, their own faces betraying the uncertainty they felt. Chloe watched as the dining area emptied, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced over at Sophia, who stood frozen near the hostess stand, her eyes wide with fear. The two locked eyes, sharing an unspoken understanding that whatever was happening was far beyond anything they had experienced before. Amidst the turmoil, the black customer remained seated at his table. He was a lone figure in a sea of vacant chairs and abandoned meals. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy surrounding him. Chloe hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to approach him once more. "Sir," she began cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper, We're closing the restaurant. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He looked up at her, his gaze steady and composed. "I understand there's been an incident," he replied softly, "but I think it's important that I stay." Chloe felt a chill run down her spine. "Please," she urged, her eyes pleading, "it's for your safety." The man offered a faint smile. "I assure you, my safety is not in jeopardy." Before Chloe could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air outside. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the restaurant's interior as police cars screeched to a halt at the entrance. Officers poured out, quickly moving to secure the building. Greg reappeared from the kitchen, his face a mask of desperation. He approached the officers, gesturing wildly as he spoke. "There's been a situation," he stammered. "In the kitchen. You need to see it." The lead officer nodded, signaling for a couple of his team to follow Greg. As they moved toward the back, other officers began instructing the remaining staff to vacate the premises. Chloe and Sophia were ushered toward the exit, along with a handful of others who had lingered behind. Chloe cast one last glance over her shoulder at the black customer. He remained seated, his eyes now fixed on Greg as he disappeared into the kitchen with the police. An unsettling realization washed over her. He wasn't surprised by any of this. In fact, he seemed to have been expecting it. Outside, the staff and customers huddled together on the sidewalk, the cold air filled with murmurs of confusion and fear. Sophia wrapped her arms around herself, her breath visible in the chill. "What is happening?" she whispered. "This doesn't make any sense." Chloe shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know, but I have a feeling it's about to come out." Inside the restaurant, the police secured the area around the kitchen. The officers who had followed Greg stood grim-faced as they surveyed the scene. Blood smeared the floor, leading to the storage room where a grim discovery awaited. Lying motionless was a figure, partially obscured by shadows. The lead detective knelt down, examining the scene with a practiced eye. "Victim appears to be male, late 30s, he noted to his partner. "Multiple wounds. This wasn't an accident." Greg hovered nearby, his hands shaken. "I had nothing to do with this," he blurted out. "I found him like this, I swear." The detective stood up, his gaze piercing. "We'll need to take your statement. For now, please wait outside." As Greg was escorted out, he caught sight of the black customer still seated calmly in the dining area. Panic flashed across his face. "You," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger, "you did this. You're trying to set me up." The officers glanced between Greg and the man at the table. One of them approached the black customer cautiously. "Sir, We're going to need you to leave the premises while we investigate." The man nodded, rising slowly from his seat. "Of course, officer," he replied smoothly. "But first, there are some things you should know." He reached into his jacket pocket, causing the officers to tense up. "Easy now," one warned, his hand moving toward his holster. The man calmly produced a leather wallet, opening it to reveal an identification badge. "Detective Marcus Reed, Internal Affairs," he stated evenly. "I've been conducting an undercover investigation into this establishment." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged surprised glances before the lead detective stepped forward. "We've heard about your operation, but we weren't expecting you here today." Detective Reed offered a slight smile. That was the point. He turned his gaze toward the window, where Greg stood outside, flanked by officers. "Gregory Thompson has been under investigation for months. Embezzlement, fraud, and now, possibly, murder." Outside, Greg's face contorted with rage and fear. "This is a setup," he screamed. "He's lying." Detective Reed shook his head slowly. "The evidence says otherwise. We received a tip that he might attempt to eliminate a potential whistleblower. It appears he acted sooner than anticipated." The lead detective nodded grimly. "We'll need to coordinate with your department. For now, let's secure the scene." As the officers moved to carry out their duties, Detective Reed glanced toward the front of the restaurant. Through the glass doors, he saw Chloe and Sophia among the crowd. Their faces reflected a mix of shock and confusion. He walked toward the entrance, pushing the door open and stepping out into the crisp air. The murmurs quieted as the crowd turned their attention to him. "Everyone," he began, his voice clear and authoritative, "I'm Detective Reed with Internal Affairs. I want to assure you that the situation is under control." Chloe stepped forward hesitantly. You were investigating Greg?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Detective Reed met her gaze. "Yes. I'm sorry for any distress this may have caused you all. It was necessary to maintain my cover to gather sufficient evidence." Sophia looked at him with wide eyes. Did someone get hurt?" He nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid so. One of your colleagues was found in the kitchen. We're treating it as a homicide." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she clutched Chloe's arm. "Who?" she whispered. Detective Reed's expression softened. "I can't disclose that information just yet, but I promise we'll do everything we can to find justice." Chloe swallowed hard, her mind reeling. The pieces began to fall into place. The mysterious behavior, the tension, Greg's unraveling. She looked back at Detective Reed. "All this time you were watching us?" He nodded gently. "I needed to observe the operations without interference. Unfortunately, events escalated more quickly than anticipated." From the other side of the police line, Greg's voice could be heard shouting protests as he was placed in handcuffs. "You won't get away with this. I have rights." Detective Reed glanced in his direction before returning his attention to the staff. "I understand this is a lot to process. There will be counselors available if you need someone to talk to." Chloe took a deep breath, her emotions a tangled web of fear, betrayal, and relief. "Thank you," she managed to say. He offered a reassuring nod. "Take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes things aren't always as they seem." As Detective Reed returned inside to continue his work, Chloe and Sophia stood together, the weight of the day's revelations settling upon them. The restaurant that had once been a place of routine and familiarity was now a crime scene, its future uncertain. "Chloe," Sophia whispered, her voice shaky, "what are we going to do?" Chloe wrapped an arm around her friend's shoulders, offering what comfort she could. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we'll get through this, together." The crowd began to disperse as the reality of the situation sank in. The sirens faded into the background, and the cold wind carried away the echoes of chaos. Amidst the uncertainty, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The remaining hours of the afternoon blurred into a haze for Chloe and Sophia. The restaurant, now cordoned off with police tape, stood as a stark reminder of the day's horrific turn. The staff huddled together outside, exchanging fragmented thoughts, some in hushed whispers, others in outright disbelief. Detective Reed moved between the crime scene and the officers stationed outside, his every step purposeful. His demeanor hadn't changed, calm and deliberate, but now everyone saw him in a new light. The quiet man who had sat unnoticed for so long was suddenly the center of everything. Greg's shouting had subsided. He sat in the back of a squad car, his face pressed against the window as he watched the commotion outside. Chloe couldn't look at him without feeling a twinge of fear. The man she had once thought of as controlling but competent now appeared desperate, broken, and something worse, guilty. As the forensic team continued their work inside, Detective Reed approached the gathered staff. His steps were heavy but measured, and his face carried a gravity that silenced the scattered conversations. "Thank you for your patience," he began, his voice steady. "I understand this has been a deeply unsettling experience for all of you. There are a few things I need to clarify, and I'll answer your questions as best as I can." The group stood in a tense semicircle, their expressions a mix of fear and curiosity. Chloe felt a nudge from Sophia, who whispered, "Ask him about Greg." Chloe hesitated before stepping forward. "Detective," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "what's going to happen to Greg? Is he really involved in what happened tonight?" Detective Reed's eyes met hers, and for a moment his expression softened. "Gregory Thompson has been under investigation for several months. We had strong evidence linking him to financial crimes within the restaurant chain, embezzlement, fraud, and other activities. Today's events, however, escalated far beyond what we expected." Sophia's voice cut in, trembling. "The murder? Did Greg—" Reed's gaze hardened slightly. "We're not drawing any conclusions yet. However, based on preliminary evidence, it appears the victim, a former supplier with ties to Greg, had confronted him over unpaid debts. That confrontation likely led to violence." Gasps rippled through the group. Sophia clutched Chloe's arm tighter. "He killed someone over money?" Chloe asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Reed shook his head. "It's too early to confirm that Greg was directly responsible. What I can tell you is that the victim's presence here wasn't random. We believe he intended to expose Greg's dealings, and Greg may have panicked." The crowd grew silent as the weight of Reed's words settled over them. Chloe felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the pieces were finally starting to come together, and dread at what those pieces revealed. "Why were you here?" Chloe blurted out, the question escaping before she could stop herself. "I mean, you've been here all day. Did you know this was going to happen?" Reed sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I was monitoring Greg's behavior. We had a tip-off that something significant was about to occur, though we didn't anticipate it would lead to murder." He glanced back at the restaurant, his expression thoughtful. "My presence was meant to observe, to gather evidence quietly. Unfortunately, events unfolded faster than we could intervene." Sophia frowned. "So, all this time you knew something was wrong, and you didn't warn us?" Reed's expression didn't waver. If I had revealed my role prematurely, it might have compromised the investigation. It's never an easy choice, but we have to prioritize the bigger picture. Chloe opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped herself. She hated the answer, but it made sense. Still, the idea that this man had been watching, knowing, while they carried on oblivious, left her feeling exposed. Greg's voice cut through the tension, muffled but audible from the squad car. "This is a setup. I didn't do anything. He's framing me." Reed's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the staff. "For now, I need you all to remain available for further questioning. If any of you recall seeing or hearing anything unusual today, no matter how small, it could be important." Chloe exchanged a glance with Sophia, then nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. Reed gave her a reassuring nod before walking back toward the restaurant. The staff watched him go, their whispers picking up again the moment he was out of earshot. Sophia leaned in close to Chloe. "This is insane," she said, her voice trembling. "Greg might have killed someone the detective was undercover, and we're just supposed to act like this is normal?" Chloe shook her head. "Nothing about this is normal," she said, "but I think we've only scratched the surface. There's more to this. There has to be." Sophia shuddered. "I just want this to be over." Chloe looked back at the restaurant, its once inviting facade now shadowed by flashing lights and police tape. Deep down, she knew that things were far from over. The events of the day had only started to unravel, and the truth, whatever it was, promised to be far darker than anyone expected. The crowd outside the restaurant had thinned, but the tension lingered, clinging to those who remained. Police officers moved in and out of the building with grim determination, their faces unreadable. For the staff, time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second heavier than the last. Chloe sat on the cold curb, her arms wrapped around her knees as she tried to steady her thoughts. Sophia sat beside her, nervously twisting a napkin in her hands. The two hadn't spoken much since Detective Reed's revelation, but the silence between them was filled with unspoken questions. Inside, Reed stood in the kitchen, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. The storage room was now brightly lit, the gruesome sight fully revealed. Blood streaked the floor, pooling around the lifeless body of a man. His clothes were disheveled, and his face bore the marks of a violent struggle. The officers photographing the scene worked methodically, their movements careful and deliberate. Reed's gaze shifted to a metal shelving unit in the corner of the storage room. Something about it caught his attention. He approached, kneeling down to examine the base. The faint outline of scuff marks on the floor suggested that the shelving unit had been moved recently. "Help me with this," he said to one of the officers. The two of them pushed the heavy unit aside, revealing a hidden compartment in the wall behind it. Reed's eyes narrowed as he reached in, pulling out a small battered ledger bound in cracked leather. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. The ledger was filled with handwritten notes, names, dates, and dollar amounts, some scrawled hastily, others meticulously recorded. Reed's frown deepened as he scanned the entries. Each page told the story of money exchanged under the table, debts owed, and favors traded. It was a damning record of corruption, implicating not only Greg but several other individuals connected to the restaurant chain. "This is it," Reed muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to the officer beside him. "Bag this as evidence. It's the key to the whole operation." Outside, Greg's protests grew louder, his voice carrying over the hum of police radios. "You don't understand. This is bigger than me," he shouted. "You're wasting your time with me. It's the investors. They're the ones pulling the strings." Reed emerged from the restaurant, holding the evidence bag containing the ledger. He approached the squad car, his expression unreadable. Greg's eyes locked onto the bag, and his face twisted with a mix of anger and desperation. "You found it, didn't you?" Greg hissed. "That's what this is about. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" Reed didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the window, his voice low but firm. "This ledger tells me plenty, Greg. But what it doesn't tell me is why someone had to die for it. Care to fill in the blanks?" Greg's face turned red, his eyes darting away. "I told you," he muttered. "It wasn't me. I didn't kill him." Reed straightened, his gaze piercing. "Then who did?" Greg remained silent, his jaw clenching as he stared straight ahead. Chloe and Sophia watched the interaction from a distance, their curiosity growing. "What do you think they found?" Sophia whispered. Chloe shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's enough to make Greg shut up." Sophia glanced toward the restaurant. "Do you think this is about more than just money?" Chloe thought back to the day's events, the strange tension, the cryptic behavior of both Greg and Detective Reed, the sense that something larger was at play. "I think this is about everything," she said softly. "The money, the murder, the way this place has been run for years. It's all connected." Reed turned his attention back to the restaurant, motioning for an officer to take Greg to the station for further questioning. As the squad car pulled away, Reed walked back toward the staff who had gathered on the sidewalk. He stopped in front of Chloe and Sophia, his face unreadable. "Thank you both for staying," he said. "There's something I need to ask you." Chloe tensed. "What is it?" Reed's gaze softened slightly. "Have either of you ever seen anything unusual in the way Greg ran this place? Anything that didn't sit right with you?" Chloe and Sophia exchanged a glance. Sophia hesitated before speaking. "There were rumors," she said carefully, "about how Greg handled the books. People said he was skimming money or not paying suppliers on time, but no one ever talked about it openly." Chloe nodded. "And he always got really defensive if anyone asked too many questions. He'd shut them down or make them disappear." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Disappear?" Chloe swallowed hard. "Not like that. I mean, they'd quit, or he'd fire them. Anyone who challenged him didn't last long." Reed nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That tracks with what we've found. Thank you." He paused, then added, "One more thing. Do either of you recognize this man?" He pulled out a photo from the evidence bag, a clear image of the victim taken from his ID. Chloe and Sophia both shook their heads. "No," Chloe said. "I've never seen him before." Sophia frowned. "Wait, I think I've heard his name. I remember Greg mentioning him once, but it was in passing. Something about a supplier who refused to deliver without payment." Reed nodded again. "That's consistent with what we know. Thank you for your help." As Reed walked away, Chloe and Sophia sat in silence for a moment. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on them, leaving them unsure of what to say. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "Do you think it's over now?" Chloe shook her head. "Not yet. Not until we know why this really happened." Sophia nodded, her expression solemn. "Then I guess we wait." The evening air turned colder as the investigation stretched on. Most of the remaining staff had been sent home, but Chloe and Sophia stayed, lingering on the edge of the crime scene. They couldn't leave, not until they understood the full truth. Inside the restaurant, Detective Reed was connecting the final pieces. The ledger, while damning, had gaps that needed to be filled. He stood in the now empty kitchen, flipping through its pages once more, his sharp eyes catching details others might have missed. Names and dates pointed to a network of corruption spanning far beyond the restaurant's walls. Suppliers, investors, and even rival businesses were implicated. But one name appeared repeatedly, marked with annotations that suggested a deeper involvement: Martin Devereaux. Reed recognized the name immediately. Devereaux was a well-known financier with a reputation for ruthless business tactics. He had invested heavily in the restaurant chain, and rumors of his questionable dealings had swirled for years. The victim's connection to Devereaux was unmistakable. He had been a middleman for deliveries that Greg had mishandled. Reed's stomach sank as he realized the implications. Greg wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn. Outside, Chloe and Sophia watched as another squad car arrived, this time carrying a well-dressed man with sharp features and a cold, calculating demeanor. Reed emerged to greet him, his body language tense. "That must be someone important," Sophia whispered. Chloe nodded. "Too important, maybe." The man introduced himself as Martin Devereaux, his voice dripping with arrogance as he demanded answers. "I was informed one of my investments is in jeopardy," he said, his tone sharp. "I expect to be briefed immediately." Reed's expression hardened. "Your investment has been the center of an ongoing investigation into financial fraud and now a homicide. I'd say it's more than just in jeopardy." Devereaux's face barely flickered. "I trust you'll find the perpetrator quickly. I have no tolerance for incompetence." Reed didn't bite. "We're finding more than one perpetrator, Mr. Devereaux. The trail leads back to your dealings with this establishment. Care to comment?" Devereaux smirked. "You'll find no evidence connecting me to anything illegal." Reed's gaze didn't waver. "The ledger we uncovered says otherwise." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Devereaux's face, but he quickly masked it, straightening his tie. "I'll be contacting my lawyers," he said before turning to leave. As Devereaux walked back to his car, Reed motioned to an officer. "Put a tail on him. We're not letting him out of our sight." By the time the crime scene was cleared, it was late. Chloe and Sophia remained nearby, watching as the restaurant they had once seen as a routine part of their lives was transformed into a nexus of scandal and tragedy. Reed approached them one final time, his expression softening. "Thank you both for your cooperation today," he said. "I know this has been overwhelming." Chloe nodded. Is he the killer?" Reed sighed. "Not likely. He's guilty of plenty, but the murder doesn't fit his profile. We believe the victim was killed by someone higher up the chain, someone trying to protect their own interests." "Devereaux?" Sophia asked hesitantly. Reed nodded. "He's a key suspect. The victim threatened to expose the corruption, and Devereaux had the most to lose." Chloe frowned. "Will he get away with it?" Reed's expression hardened. "Not if I can help it." As the squad cars pulled away and the flashing lights dimmed, the two women were left standing in the quiet night. The restaurant, once a hub of activity, now loomed behind them, a shadow of what it once was. Sophia finally broke the silence. "Do you think it'll reopen?" Chloe shook her head. "Not for a long time, and if it does, it'll never be the same." The two walked away, their steps slow and heavy. They had been witnesses to something far larger than they had imagined, a tangled web of greed, corruption, and violence that had changed their lives forever. Weeks later, the news broke that Martin Devereaux had been arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and financial fraud. Greg, though complicit in the corruption, cooperated with authorities, providing evidence that sealed Devereaux's fate. The restaurant remained closed, its future uncertain. For Chloe and Sophia, life moved on, but the events of that day lingered in their minds. They had learned a harsh truth about the world, that appearances could be deceiving, and power often came at a devastating cost. And for Detective Reed, the case was just another reminder of why he did what he did, to uncover the hidden truths, no matter how deeply buried they were.